often mischaracterized, misportrayed as in like it was a losing war and that it was going very badly, and Gorbachev ended up pulling out because they were losing. That wasn't the case. They were winning. Despite all of the odds against them, all of the foreign imperialist countries, neighboring countries supporting the terrorist forces, they were winning. The Soviet and Afghan government were winning. They had control of the situation. They had just pulled off major military operations against the so-called Mujahideen. Gorbachev ended up pulling out Soviet forces. Despite that, though, it's interesting. You compare the pro-Soviet government, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, Socialist Afghanistan, how that stood compared to this pro-U.S. government that just collapsed within less than a month.
Yeah.
The Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, it was renamed. It was no longer called the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, but it was still run by the People's Democratic Party. And at the time, the leader, Mohammed Najibullah. That government outlasted the Soviet Union, actually. It lasted for 3 years after the Soviet forces pulled out from Afghanistan. April of 1978, there was the Sour Revolution in Afghanistan. And during the time period when it was prior to the socialist government in Afghanistan, before the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, even before that, Afghanistan had good relations with the Soviet Union. And again, the Soviet Union was the first country to recognize Afghanistan's independence. And the Soviet Union being neighbors with Afghanistan, a lot of Afghans went to the Soviet Union to study, and a lot of people from throughout the world, third world, would go to the Soviet Union to study for free and become, experts in various fields, technicians, and various expertise, and then they'd come back and develop their country. And a lot of Afghans were studying in the Soviet Union and learned about Marxism, Leninism, communism, and coming from such an impoverished country, this was very appealing to them. And many Afghan students became communists in the Soviet Union and brought those ideas back to Afghanistan. And that's what made the People's Democratic Party grow and become such a powerful force before it eventually came to power. And that's an interesting situation. It's quite complicated because one aspect about this that is often uh, goes without being mentioned and is not as well known about is um, that actually the CIA in the United States did a lot to try and create a situation in Afghanistan where the Afghan communists were forced to overthrow the government in self-defense. And something that is that you could see in examples of revolutions around the world is that when revolutions happen, they're actually acts of self-defense, and they're not
Yeah.
this idea that a lot of ultra leftists think of as just, oh, let's get guns and have a violent revolution just for the sake of it. No, there's it in every
It's
example.
necessity.
Exactly. It's self-defense, and it's out of necessity for survival. And in Afghanistan, the Communist Party in Afghanistan, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, they were being heavily targeted by the Dawood government, which was the government before the socialist government came about. Uh, with the leader, his name was Dawood, and he actually, for a while, he had decent relations with the Soviet Union. But over time, the CIA and other arms of U.S. soft power started to try and get Dawood to change policy, and he started to crack down heavily on the Communist Party in Afghanistan, which forced them to basically, they had a choice: either they were going to be completely destroyed and their members executed, or they had to seize power. And some say that actually they weren't quite prepared at that point to seize power, but nonetheless, they at that point they carried out the revolution, the April Revolution, and toppled the Dawood regime in 1978. and they began implementing socialist policies, land reform, education, mass education, literacy campaigns. Afghanistan was an extremely impoverished country, and like any socialist country, when the revolutionary forces come to power, one of the first things that they do is work on literacy, because they understand for there to be build up, industrialization, development of the country, you need to have an educated public who can learn and become experts in various fields to build up the country. And so they were doing that, huge literacy campaigns,
Yeah.
and healthcare, providing healthcare, land reform, breaking up feudalism, giving the land to the peasantry, and the reactionary elements in the country, feudal, former landlords, former ruling class, they didn't like this, and they spread propaganda to try and delegitimize the government.
Yeah,
And
there's something like it's the godless communists, I believe.
right, exactly, propaganda like that. While there was that, on the other hand, there were disputes within the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, and there were different factions. And yeah, so the first socialist leader of Afghanistan was Nur Muhammad Taraki, and he was overthrown by another leader of the PDPA from the what's called the Khalq faction of the party, named Hafizullah Amin. And when Hafizullah Amin came to power, there was a shift in policy, and he took a more extreme position. He had a much more extreme policy, and he was seen as much more heavy-handed. And
Was that considered extreme in the sense of secularizing the country?
yeah, and
Right. So that
improving.
that kind of had a reciprocal backlash with the more fundamentalist types of the former feudal ruling class who could weaponize that and kind of develop more of the fundamentalist jihadist factions.
Yeah, exactly. And he was later he was later described by the People's Democratic Party as adventurist, and
Mm.
his policies were very counterproductive and actually inflamed
Right.
and gave more credibility to the opposition.
Right, right. And that's a perfect example of when a leftist gets ahead of the masses and starts pushing what I call like social accelerationism, kind of similar to the Great Cultural Revolution in China,
Mhm.
where when you start pushing social change or changing the traditions and the norms too rapidly, you're going to have a pushback with folks, and that can actually put the revolution at risk when it's no longer seen when it's seen potentially as not being of the people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, he really was causing a lot of trouble. And actually, he had actually had the first socialist leader killed. He actually
Oh,
assassinated Taraki, and there was a lot of suspicion within the Soviet Union of this leader. I mean, because ostensibly he's a communist and ostensibly a more revolutionary communist, but they're also suspicious of him as possibly being an American agent,
mm,
because the reason being that this is the perfect guise. You can't claim to be the more revolutionary wing of the communists, but what you're actually doing is you're
it's counterproductive.
sabotaging. Yeah,
Yeah,
you're being counterproductive. You're sabotaging the revolution, and you are causing more and more people to take issue with the government by not only taking these more extreme positions, but also having a more heavy hand in dealing with the opposition, and maybe being too brutal with people who aren't necessarily reactionaries, but maybe there's
right,
misunderstandings and stuff, and taking like too much of a heavy-handed position on dealing with issues to sort of deliberately cause more hostility towards the government.
What I find fascinating about this point is this is something that we talk a lot about in the modern day when it comes to ultra leftism. And folks often think, who are of the ultra leftist tendencies, often think we have no historical precedent for what we're talking about. But there's loads of it. And this is a perfect example where when we see people who are behaving in ostensibly like wrecking type situations, at the very least, we're going to be wary of them and see the counterproductive impact they have on the left. So, regardless if we think they're feds or agents or whatever, we at least want to distance ourselves from those types if there's any hope of success for the movement we hope to bring about.
Right, exactly. And it's almost like at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether they're an agent or just a complete
Yeah.
idiot.
Yeah.
Because they have the same, like in this situation with Hafizullah Amin, whether he was an agent or he was just, foolish ultra leftist, he was having the same effect, which was he was causing a threat to the revolution. He was um, causing a lot of people to oppose the government, the Afghan government, that may have otherwise been supportive of the government. And and again, there was the factional dispute between the Parcham faction of the PDPA, People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, and the Khalq faction. And Amin was from the Khalq faction. So yeah, he was causing all these issues, and so this is prior to the Soviet
Yeah.
intervention, so-called invasion.
Yeah, so leading up to that, we know now as a fact that various, I guess, I'm not sure if they were called this at the time, but what would become the Mujahideen, they were kind of nudged along by the CIA. And very clever, devious fellow, I can't pronounce his first name correctly, Zygabru
Yep,
Brzezinski.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, yeah, something like that.
Brzezinski. This was his strategy. It's like we wanting to give the Soviet Union their Vietnam, arming some rebels. And what was very interesting is the fun. By the way, throughout the podcast, how do you want to refer to the fundamentalists? Do you want to say jihadist or mujahideen or I'll let you pick.
I feel like the best way is probably so-called Mujahideen,
Okay.
because Mujahideen, it actually has like, the Islamic meaning and stuff. I feel like this
Okay.
call them so-called. It's like they don't deserve like to.
Right.
But that way people know what we're talking about. Like that's what they're technically,
Right.
referred to in history.
Put some air quotes around it.
Yeah.
So the so-called Mujahideen, what was very interesting is they were very, very reactionary. Like you said, wanting to take stuff back to the feudal times. Even throughout all the narratives in the modern or 2001 onwards, they're talking about medievalism, and that part is true. They're not making that up. But what's interesting is when these folks were in the camp of helping advancing the U.S. imperialist goals in the region, they were romanticized to the synthetic left. They were like, look at these mystical, kind of some of that Orientalism, as Edward Said would say. It's like, look at these magical people fighting this war against these like cold-hearted communists.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were some factions of the opposition. I don't think they'd be necessarily included in the so-called Mujahideen, because they weren't Islamist fundamentalists, but they were on their side. There were actually some, and again, they were very small. They weren't really a factor, really, but there were some Maoist groups that were fighting on the side of the so-called Mujahideen against the Afghan government. And that's the reason I bring them up, is because they were hardly a factor. They had very little to no impact. They were very small. You can't even find you'd be hard pressed to find online any battles they took part in. But the reason I bring them up is because I remember some years back when I was involved with some Maoist groups, and the issue of Afghanistan would come up. I would be, talking about the history of the Afghan socialist government and their great achievements and so on. And these ultras would bring up, oh, but the Maoists, the true communists, they were fighting against the government. And it's like they had no impact on the situation in Afghanistan. The leader of this Maoist group ended up getting assassinated by one of the other so-called Mujahideen groups. Ended up having him assassinated. So the same people he was fighting alongside against the evil Soviet socialist imperialists, so-called, their allies, the so-called Mujahideen, had their leader, the Maoist leader, assassinated. But the reason I bring it up is because, like you said, with the synthetic left, there's a lot of angles to it. You know, some of the so-called Maoists, they'll point to that as reason for why the Afghan socialist government was bad, and then others will they'll glorify the so-called Mujahideen
Right.
for other reasons,
It,
anti-Stalinism, supposedly, stuff like that.
it really is interesting about how the synthetic left because you can see that Orientalism, just that kind of like building up with some of the groups that were being pushed by the the Congress for Cultural Freedoms, the Hare Krishna movement from India, very far right, if anybody wants to know about that. And then I think they were pushing some kind of proto-Falun Gong group as well, if I'm correct. And there seems to be a lot to be gained for Western imperialism to keep a faction of the left very poorly educated on the East and the global South. Like, to keep them very much in the dark by having any knowledge about the situations there, having very essentialist views about different cultures, and also very Orientalist views. So when they see the so-called Mujahideen fighters fighting against the communists, their knowledge in the West is that Stalinism bad. So this group is looking so ethnic and so mystical that they must be incredible. But really, they're the people that want to roll back progress. They want to smash the literacy, make sure women can't go to schools, all this stuff. And yet you have time and time again the synthetic left falls into supporting these reactionary groups because they're fighting against the tankies or the Stalinists, quote unquote. We're doing a lot of air quotes today.
Yep. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, when you deal with liars, unfortunately, you have to use a lot of the air quotes.
There's some streams I do where I feel like every buzzword I use air quotes, actually.
Yeah. Going into the Orientalism, a lot of it also had to do with the fact that there's this Orientalist view of like these civilizations, like especially Islamic civilizations, but in general, non-Western civilizations, like, this, they'll phrase it as like, this beautiful primitive, whatever they try and play it as. And then they talk about how, the Afghan communists, they're changing society. They'll frame it as though people in any society do not want to live in poverty. They want to live with a decent standard of living. They want to have education. They want to have opportunities. They want the country to develop. That's why these literacy campaigns and the development of the country was extremely popular with the Afghan people themselves.
Yeah.
But when the Western media tries to portray this stuff, they try and make it seem as though, the Afghan communists, they're changing society, and it's better for these countries to stay in their old ways, and they don't need education, they don't need roads and electricity, and that's very much that Orientalist mindset. And I think that aspect of it really exposes the imperialist essence of this Orientalism, which is that it's this mindset of keeping these countries poor and from keeping them from developing.
Absolutely. That's where you get this handshake between the far right of those countries with the synthetic left of the Western countries. And it's so interesting because you can even look at you and me, right? Like when we're talking about South Asia, or you're talking about the Arab world, we're talking about development. We're talking about like some real futurist type thinking. You know what I mean? Yet liberals of today will tell us, just be ethnic, celebrate your holidays, eat your food, which is all well and good. It's all well and good. Believe me, I love that too. But, as soon as you start talking about, scientific socialism, dialectical materials that people are like, whoa, put the book down, don't read. Stay illiterate. To this day, like you and I see this type of stuff. So it's like it hasn't gone away. It's as potent as ever. The whole Vosh clique, they want folks to stay illiterate. They want folks still living in caves.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's such a tragedy that people don't know about the socialist government in Afghanistan. I've seen people on the Western liberals, synthetic left, who literally say that the U.S. occupation was what was bringing progressivism to Afghanistan. They're saying that. They're not even thinking about the resources. This is about the resources. This is about the geopolitical strategy. It's not about the progressivism. George Bush wasn't talking about no progressivism. Okay.
Yeah.
But what's hilarious
because they don't they, as I was saying at the beginning of this, they act as if history just started yesterday, and it's like all this discussion. They just in the media, it's like all day they're talking about Afghanistan, but never do they actually spend like maybe they'll talk about the so-called Soviet invasion briefly. They'll mention that, but they'll never talk about the socialist era in Afghanistan and how actually there was a time period where Afghanistan was doing very well and developing.
Right.
And women had excellent rights. People in general had excellent rights. And it's really disgusting how they hide this from people, because if people knew about socialist era of Afghanistan, it would be so clear. One of the arguments you always hear from the anti-communists, the right-wingers, is, socialism, communism never works. But if you look at Afghanistan, there's no way anyone could try to argue that the socialist era of Afghanistan is worse than the 90s or now. I mean, it's night and day. You compare socialist Afghanistan to what's been there after. There's no way in hell anyone could argue that socialism did not work in Afghanistan.
It's wild, man. I saw, synthetic lefties and Western liberals and what have you were literally saying that it was the U.S. occupation that was, solidifying rights for Afghan women. They're totally ignoring, and the literacy too, both for girls and for boys, right? They're totally ignoring all of that of what was accomplished with the Star Revolution. And you posted, I shared in my community tab, a video of Afghan women saying, like, we want the U.S. occupation out of here. Now, I might be jumping ahead, because we're going to talk about that later. But I was putting a pin in it for now. But that people don't know about this era, I hope listening to the first half of this podcast could really just, be the tip of the iceberg for people to look into this stuff and show socialism has worked. It has brought results for people. It's when you roll back that progress. It's when you support the reactionaries uncritically, when you support U.S. imperialism and the havoc it brings to these lands. And I think that's going to be the next half of this podcast, starting with the Brzezinski strategy and really getting those so-called Mujahideen and the fundamentalists into full gear, if you want to go into that a bit more.
Yeah, so around this time period with Hafizul Amin, before the so-called Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the actual Soviet intervention in support of the Afghan government, something that is not well known about but is extremely important is that actually the U.S. was giving support to the anti-government terrorists in Afghanistan before the Soviet military entered, before the supposed Soviet invasion, which happened in late December of 1979. Before that, the U.S. was busy trying to foment chaos and instability in Afghanistan, trying to overthrow the Afghan government. And the proof of that is from Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor under Jimmy Carter. And he had a huge role in supporting, getting U.S. support to the so-called Mujahideen, what would later be Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And in a very revealing statement, Brzezinski, with an interview with a French paper, Le Nouvel Observer, or something like that, in 1998, Brzezinski said, quote, According to the official version of history, the CIA aid to the Mujahideen began during 1980. That is to say, after the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan on December 24th, 1979. But in reality, secretly guarded, the reality secretly guarded until now is completely otherwise. Indeed, it was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. So this is Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor
Yeah,
to Jimmy Carter,
I heard it from the man himself.
admitting in an interview with French news that before the Soviet so-called invasion that the U.S. was so up in arms about, and Jimmy Carter gave a speech about, the horrible Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the humanity and everything, about this in late 1979. Well, this is Brzezinski admitting that before that happened, the United States was there through the CIA supporting the anti-Afghan government terrorists, the so-called Mujahideen, before the Soviet army even so-called invaded Afghanistan. And as he mentioned in the end there, he said that he believed that this would basically force the Soviets to intervene. And as we were talking earlier about the situation before the Afghan communists came to power, the strategy of Brzezinski was to, I think you had mentioned earlier, give this give the Soviet Union its own Vietnam. And if you think about that, the mindset of that, sort of the vindictiveness, like the United States was
Yeah,
defeated by the Vietnamese revolutionaries, and the U.S. is psychologically uh, destroyed by that, just wants to get even with the Soviet Union. Not even imagining that it was the Vietnamese themselves, of course, with Soviet support, but it was the Vietnamese
right.
themselves that defeated the U.S. And the U.S. is so vindictive about that they want to, quote, give the Soviet Union its own Vietnam. Not, don't worry about any whatever country it is that gets in the way of that, and those people getting killed in the crossfires of
Right.
that war. Don't worry about that. But we just have to give the Soviets their own
Sickening.
Vietnam. Yeah.
Horrible, man. Yeah.
And and in that quote at the end, he says that he believes that it would get the Soviets to move in. The Soviets were they were very concerned, and they did not want to actually send forces into Afghanistan. And it was actually the Afghan government that was basically pleading with them to send support because of what the
Right.
terrorists were doing. And there's this myth. People think people that even know any of this, they think like, oh, the Mujahideen, they weren't terrorists. They were, they
Freedom
were,
fighters.
yeah, they were so-called freedom fighters. And it was later a few of the fringe Islamist sections who were terrorists of the Taliban and Al Qaeda. But no, they were terrorists from the beginning. What they were doing,
Right.
they were assassinating people, killing civilians, blowing up civilian targets, sabotage, blowing up civilian buildings and bridges and stuff, killing civilians, assassinating politicians, killing teachers and stuff, killing diplomats, absolutely terrorism. And
Yeah.
this was what they were doing, and the Afghan government wanted support to deal with this. And eventually, the Soviet Union did intervene and sent its military in late December of 1979. And I think one issue that is, I think it's worth mentioning, and if it was left out, people would say, "Oh, that's proof that this is propaganda or whatever." But it's worth mentioning is that when the Soviets intervened, they did have the leader of Afghanistan, Amin, who I had mentioned earlier. They did actually kill him
Right.
themselves. And people will point to that and say, "Oh, you see, Soviet social imperialism. They're killing the leader of Afghanistan." But that leader, Amin, had actually overthrown and killed the first Afghan socialist
Right.
leader.
Right. Right.
And if these people are talking about how the Afghan government is so brutal, well, then shouldn't they applaud
Should
the
they be
Soviets
happy
for
about that?
killing Amin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so funny the way how wishy-washy these people are. Like one minute they're all like, "Oh, this is so bad," and then when the socialists actually surpass their expectations, they're like, "Well, we didn't want them to do that."
It's reminiscent of the situation with Cambodia and Vietnam. It's like they'll talk about how evil Pol Pot is, and then who
Yeah.
overthrew.
Yeah, it's the Vietnamese, and then people like socialists are always fighting each other.
Yeah.
They always turn on each other. Where's the solidarity? It's like...
Yeah.
Exactly.
But so now into the period of the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, and what's often called, I think erroneously, the Soviet-Afghan War. I think that term is so incorrect, and unfortunately, it's quite widespread. But it's so incorrect because it erases the Afghan government and the Afghan progressives, the Afghan
Right.
socialists, truly the Afghan patriots in reality. It erases them, and this is what imperialist media always does. And I
Yeah.
think I was talking about this with Ramiro
Right.
in a previous discussion, how the media, they will erase the pro-Maduro, pro-Venezuelan government Venezuelans. They'll erase the pro-Assad, pro-Syrian government Syrians, and they'll only show you the opposition. And in this case, that's exactly what they're doing in the
Yeah.
situation in Afghanistan. They're erasing the huge percentage of Afghans who support the progressive policies of the Afghan government, particularly Afghan women,
Absolutely.
who are have a great, huge levels of rights compared to what came after it and before. Excellent women's rights, and the working class, the poor of Afghanistan, whose living standards are increasing very well. When they talk about so-called Soviet-Afghan war, they erase all of the pro-Soviet Afghans, and they make it seem as though the CIA-backed Afghans, and actually many of, like in Syria, Libya, all these destabilization campaigns, a lot of the people who fought against the Afghan government and the Soviets weren't even Afghans. They were international jihadists.
Yeah.
And
Going over kind of like the ISIS formula that's more recent for people's memory is going over to form a caliphate and whatnot.
I was just going to say, and at this point in Afghanistan, this is sort of like the first experiment for that, what later was done with ISIS, where they have this international so-called jihad, and it's so insane that they try to frame it as fighting for Islam when it's backed by the U.S., Britain, and of course, even though Afghanistan, it's not in the Arab world, it's a bit far away, Israel is supporting the so-called Mujahideen. I mean, what does that tell you? The Mossad is supporting them. What does that tell you? When Israel is a great friend of jihad, according to, a great friend of, I mean, come on, this is, does it get any more blatant than this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, but going back to the situation in 1980s Afghanistan, it's an interesting situation, the international dynamics to it, because again, it's not too well known, but it's admitted by Brzezinski, who was the sort of the architect behind it, that the CIA and the US were supporting the anti-Afghan government terrorists before the Soviets invaded. And the whole argument for the US supporting like the like the Reaganites and stuff, and the government people and neocons and stuff, the whole argument for them supporting the so-called Mujahideen was supposedly to stop so-called Soviet aggression. That was the whole argument. But when the U.S. was supporting the Mujahideen by the admission of like the mastermind behind it, Brzezinski, one of the biggest masterminds behind it, when he admits that they were doing it before the Soviet military went in, that completely discredits this whole idea of supposed Soviet aggression. Besides the U.S., I mentioned Israel was giving support to the so-called Mujahideen. It's interesting. There are many different countries supporting the counter-revolution in Afghanistan, the imperialist aggression in Afghanistan via the so-called Mujahideen. And there are different factions within the Mujahideen, so-called Mujahideen.
The main grouping was based inside of Pakistan, and Pakistan at this point had a very reactionary, pro-imperialist leader named Zia-ul Haq, who not only was a huge supporter of the overthrow of the Afghan government, but he also had a huge brutal crackdown on the left inside of Pakistan. Pakistan previously had a left-wing president, and I believe Zia-ul Haq actually was the leader who had that president executed. And all of the U.S. aid basically went through Pakistan, and they had camps along the border, training and arming the terrorists. And the countries that were involved with that were the U.S., Britain, Saudi Arabia, and China played a very big role in that. It's an unfortunate thing. At that point, it was Deng Xiaoping, and he was, foreign policy-wise, he was aligned with the United States, and China actually played a very big role in that. I'm sure that's something that China very much regrets now.
Oh, yeah, because what's
Situation
happening in Xinjiang. Right, exactly. And that was kind of still the echoes of the Sino-Soviet split was still manifested, basically.
Although I think at that point, like with the Sino-Soviet split with Mao, it was a little different. With Mao, oftentimes they sided with the U.S. I think at this point, it was more so like more of an open alliance with the U.S. There were like China agreed to allow U.S. listening posts, U.S. military listening posts inside of China near the Soviet border. There was like very close collaboration. China was very much aligned with U.S. imperialism at that point in Afghanistan. A lot of the weapons used by the Mujahideen were Chinese copies of Soviet weaponry. And so the weaponry, that's an important angle for like the support for the foreign support for the Mujahideen. So China was giving like copies of Soviet-made weaponry, like Type 56 especially, which is the Chinese version of the AK-47. And the idea was that the U.S. was like, okay, we're not going to give them M16s, although they did give some M16s, and you could find the Soviets did capture some M16s, but the majority of the weapons that were used and provided to the so-called Mujahideen were Soviet or Soviet copies, because the idea was they wanted to have plausible deniability behind it. And so China played a very important role in that.
Right. I see there.
And Israel also played an important role with that, because you got to remember, Israel was fighting for many decades against Arab socialist, Arab nationalist militaries, and also the Palestinians, who were using almost entirely Soviet weaponry. So the Israelis had quite a stockpile of captured Soviet weapons that were captured from Arab forces, and Israel sent over a lot of those weapons to Pakistan to give to the so-called Mujahideen. And I think that's a very important aspect, because a lot of the Islamists, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, they claim to be like the vanguard of Islam, and they say like the Arab socialists, Islamic socialists.
They're like kind of like the Zionist equivalents to some degree.
Yeah, and they try to argue like Arab socialists, the Afghan socialists, Islamic communists, Islamic socialists are not true Muslims and stuff, and that they are the Al-Qaeda and the Islamists. They're the true Muslims and true defenders, true vanguard of Islam. But this is such a great example of why that's bullshit, because they're working hand in hand with Israel against the Afghan socialists and the Soviets, like directly getting support from Israel, who is obviously, occupying Jerusalem, which is extremely important for Islam, killing the Palestinians and other Arabs. So this completely debunks the whole myth that the Islamists are supposedly the vanguards of the Islamic world and stuff.
So like you said, they're just kind of fronting there. I guess the main thing for the Islamists would just be power, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of them themselves just being direct agents of imperialism, in which
Yeah.
case that's just their propaganda, and it doesn't matter if it
Right.
matches up. But that's so there were the based in Pakistan, there were the biggest section of the Mujahideen, but also something that's a little bit lesser known is that there were also Shia Mujahideen, so-called Mujahideen, who at this point, there was the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and Khomeini was anti-US, but also extremely anti-Soviet and anti-communist and anti-socialist.
Yeah.
And Iran was giving support to, because again, Afghanistan is a very diverse country, and they have a lot of different ethnic groups and religious sects. And there's a lot of Shias in the western part of Afghanistan. And Iran was supporting certain Shia so-called Mujahideen groups to fight against the Afghan government and the Soviets. And the Soviets actually shot down 2 Iranian helicopters that had passed into, violated the border. And they weren't as big. The Al Qaeda type and Hezbi Islami, the more Sunni, so-called Sunni terrorist groups were the main anti-government forces. But it's worth mentioning there were also the Shia groups. I think the one thing, this is very interesting, that people don't think about is actually the Iran-Iraq War. From the anti-imperialist perspective, that's also often viewed very negatively. But actually, in this case, in the situation of Afghanistan, the Iran-Iraq War was actually very positive for Afghanistan because the Iraqi army fighting against the Iranian army basically tied Iran's hands and made Iran distracted from funding terrorists in Afghanistan. And if it wasn't for the war with Iraq, Iran would certainly be giving a lot more support to the Shia, so-called Mujahideen groups in Afghanistan. It's sort of interesting. You look at all these forces that align to fight against the socialists, communists. You have the Western imperialists, the Zionists. You have Shia fundamentalists and Sunni fundamentalists all coming together to fight against the Afghan communists and the Soviets. And I think
that's a huge confluence of forces that somebody just getting the basic takes would just have such a simplified view of the whole situation.
Yeah, and it really shows you, like, who is the threat to imperialism? Is it the Islamists, or is it the communists and socialists? Because again, the Islamists, the Zionists, the Western imperialists, they all united against the communists and socialists.
Wow. It's wild because people say how, socialism just fails, but it's like it took that much powerful forces to stop socialism in Afghanistan. It's like, it seems like Afghanistan was the real unite the right.
Yeah.
When it comes to like the actual powerful forces in the world, not some like nerds with tiki torches in Charlottesville.
Yeah. Operation Cyclone, that was the CIA operation to fund the anti-Afghan government and anti-Soviet forces in Afghanistan. And there's this myth that like they try and make an equivalency between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan with any other country. Like when they talk about like the graveyard of empires, they try and make it seem as though the Soviet Union was just another empire and they fared
that's a big one. And it goes into the whole synthetic left and Maoist analysis of Soviet social imperialism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a total simplification of what happened and total disregard of actual history.
It's like just what you said about the phrasing of the Afghan-Soviet war, how the erasure of the Afghan progressives in the situation, and like you're mentioning with your talk with Romero, the language, it's like small sleight of hands and tricks that can just really just change the whole framing of how folks look at historical events.
Exactly, because if you think about it, like most people aren't going to look in depth into the situation. They're not
Right.
going to like read the stuff, but they see like Wikipedia article or they see somewhere listed Soviet-Afghan war. So in their head, okay, it's the war between the Soviets and the Afghans, not a
Right.
war between the Soviets on one side with the Afghans on their side against a small group of terrorists that are backed by foreign powers, including the former colonizer of Afghanistan, which is Britain.
Britain. There we
Um,
go. And it's almost like just like what we spoke about in the podcast we did on Palestine a couple months ago, when they say it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to make it seem like both sides are equally matched when it's anything but.
right. And these things are important because, again, the average person, unfortunately, isn't necessarily going to look that in depth into this, but they'll see the title of the
Yeah.
article. They'll see Soviet-Afghan War, Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and from that, that'll give them an idea in their head about what it's about, which is like the imperialist-friendly narrative of it.
Yeah.
And
When people say don't question the narrative, they're referring to don't question what the imperialist media says about the situation. And
yeah,
people can say they're left wing all they want, but all I hear is CNN talking at me.
yeah, and yeah, and the Soviets are actually quite successful in Afghanistan. They had strong control over the country. In certain areas, they had lesser control, like in certain because again, Afghanistan, it's a mostly mountainous country, very difficult terrain. So there were certain areas, especially along the border with Pakistan, where they didn't have control. Because again, like all of the or the vast majority of the support for the terrorists was coming in through the border with Pakistan. Again, some of it was coming to from Iran to the Shia groups in the western part, but the majority of like the Mujahideen terrorists was from the border in Pakistan. And so areas around the border they had difficulty controlling, but generally they controlled the cities. They had a lot of control of the countryside, and they were able to, when the so-called Mujahideen would try and siege a city, they would be able to repel it, and they'd be able to take the fight to the Mujahideen, and keep the development of the country going for the most part in Afghanistan. And one particular operation that people, I think, could look into to find interesting is this operation towards the later part of the war, Operation Magistral, which is a joint Soviet-Afghan operation where the Soviets and Afghans uh, took a, a territory near the border of Pakistan that was supposedly the so-called Mujahideen brag that it was their impregnable fortress. The Soviets and Afghans had to clear like 3 kilometers of mines, and then the area was extremely heavily armed with heavy machine guns, mortars, recoilless rifles, anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft, extremely heavily armed, heavily mined, and difficult terrain. And the Soviets and Afghan government forces were able to kick the so-called Mujahideen out of there. And the Mujahideen were they lost so badly that they basically ran out of there. They had to run, got out of there because they feared getting encircled, and they left a huge, massive stockpile of supplies behind that the Soviets and Afghans were able to capture. And with the imperialist support for the so-called Mujahideen, one thing that's often talked about is the Stinger missiles, the anti-aircraft, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, and at the time that was the most sophisticated. Like that was the best thing the U.S. had as far as that type of weaponry for anti-aircraft. Like they gave the Mujahideen like the top technology. That had an impact, making it more difficult for aircraft to operate. The Soviets adopted their strategy and they were able to get around it, but that changed the war to an extent. I think that's kind of overemphasized to an extent. Like that was the turning point. It certainly was a significant change, and it showed it was a signal that the United States was willing to, um, go to further lengths to try and destabilize Afghanistan. But the Soviets were able to get around that, changing their air tactics, and especially using a lot of flares and stuff to protect the aircraft. And the Soviets pushed on. Unfortunately, at this point, the ruler in the Soviet Union was Gorbachev, and I think a
Right.
lot of the audience is probably aware of him and his liberal tendencies and what he ended up doing to the USSR, basically sabotaging it. And likewise, he sabotaged the war effort in Afghanistan, and he ended up pulling Soviet troops out, even though, again, it's often mischaracterized, misportrayed as in like it was a losing war and that it was going very badly, and Gorbachev ended up pulling out because they were losing. That wasn't the case. They were winning. Despite all of the odds against them, all of the foreign imperialist countries, neighboring countries supporting the terrorist forces, they were winning. The Soviet and Afghan government were winning. They had control of the situation. They had just pulled off major military operations against the so-called Mujahideen, and Gorbachev ended up pulling out Soviet forces. Despite that, though, it's interesting. You compare the pro-Soviet government, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, Socialist Afghanistan, how that stood compared to this pro-U.S. government that just collapsed within less than a month.
Yeah.
The Democratic Republic
Yeah.
of Afghanistan, it was renamed. It was no longer called the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, but it was still run by the People's Democratic Party, and at the time, the leader, Mohammed Najibullah. Um, that government outlasted the Soviet Union, actually. It lasted for 3 years after the Soviet forces pulled out from Afghanistan. And that's, keep in mind, the US, China, Britain, Saudi Arabia, all these countries through Pakistan continuing to support the Mujahideen after the Soviets have pulled out. And the Soviets, even though they pulled out, they had tried to make peace agreements um, with the U.S., saying that the Soviets would stop sending supplies to the Afghan government if the U.S. would stop arming the so-called Mujahideen. And of course, the United States rejected that offer. And I think that's a perfect example because the Soviets, they're trying to offer a peace proposal. They'll stop giving arms to the Afghan government if the U.S. stops giving arms to the Mujahideen, and it's the U.S. who refuses that peace proposal.
Wow, there we go.
So yeah, you look at the pro-Soviet Afghan government after the Soviets left. It lasted for 3 years after the Soviets left, with non-stop imperialist support coming in to the opposition, the terrorists, the so-called Mujahideen, non-stop support going into them. Nonetheless, the Afghan government lasted for 3 years after the Soviets left. Actually, outlasted the Soviet Union itself, which is pretty interesting. Um, and if you compare that to what just happened in Afghanistan now with the pro-U.S. government, how it lasted just a few weeks and
Yeah.
collapsed so fast compared to 3 years against not just the Taliban, but all the multiple factions, basically all the factions of the so-called Mujahideen. Um, they lasted for 3 years, and I think this is probably a good point to talk about the different factions during this whole time period with the fighting against the Mujahideen, so-called Mujahideen, in Afghanistan. I was sort of talking about like how there was the divide between the vast majority who were stationed in Pakistan, but then there were a few that were backed by Khomeiniist Iran. Within that, though, there's a lot of factions, and some people, they try to muddy the waters when you point out how the U.S. created Al Qaeda and the Taliban. They'll say, well, they weren't the Taliban, they weren't Al Qaeda at that time period. That came later, and they try to confuse the situation. But no,
first of all,
the continuity of their actions and their motivations is direct and unbroken.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. The motivations and the actions, the type of things they do. And the other thing is that, well, first of all, the Taliban, they don't call themselves the Taliban. Al Qaeda doesn't call itself Al Qaeda. Those are like American intelligence agency names for these groups. These fighters, Osama bin Laden, Mullah Omar, these other figures within the Taliban and Al Qaeda, they were active fighting against the Afghan socialist government and the Soviets. So for someone to say like, "Oh, it wasn't Taliban," then it's the same people with the same ideology doing the same sort of terrorism. The thing is, though, since they're killing Afghans and Soviets, these people will say, "Oh, they're not terrorists." Once they kill Americans on 9/11, then they're terrorists. But when they're killing Afghans and Soviets, that doesn't matter. You know, they're not Westerners. So
It's
when Al
funny
Qaeda
because I
and
believe, and these films are often seen as the paragon of U.S. imperialism personified in a man. But the Rambo movies, in the
oh right,
third
yep,
one,
yep.
I believe in the third one at the title card, it says this film is dedicated to all the brave and noble Mujahideen fighters or
That's
something.
right. Yep. And it's something interesting that became very embarrassing for the U.S. after
Yeah,
9/11. They actually released another version of that for
yeah,
TV version where it doesn't say that. They like scrubbed that part for like the TV version, most of the TV versions post 9/11, because that
yeah.
suddenly became very embarrassing.
A little bit more of an embarrassment than Donald Trump showing up at Home Alone 2.
Right. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So at this point, there's multiple factions. You know, technically these groups, they weren't called Al Qaeda or so-called Taliban and stuff like that, but you know they had the same sort of extreme fundamentalist mindset, same terrorist actions, and it was the same people. Bin Laden was there fighting against the Soviets and Afghan communists. um, all these groups were there. They were under different names and stuff, and some of them even used the same names. Again, they Al Qaeda doesn't call itself Al Qaeda. Taliban doesn't call itself Taliban. It just the U.S. labeled them that
Right.
afterwards. But they were terrorists back then, and they're terrorists now, and they were supported. And Al Qaeda and the Taliban would not exist if it was not for the CIA. And
Absolutely.
anyone who tries to hide that is being dishonest. They're trying to muddy the waters. These groups, these individuals, they had the same ideology, same terrorist mindset. It was just that they were busy killing Afghans primarily, as well as Soviets, so they weren't considered terrorists. Once they had overthrown the Afghan government and the Soviets weren't in Afghanistan anymore, that's when they started to target Westerners, and then all of a sudden they were called terrorists, but they were always
Yeah,
terrorists.
absolutely.
Um, but these groups, after overthrowing the Afghan government, began to turn guns on each other in the 90s, and there was basically a civil war. I mean, the whole thing was a civil war. You could say the war in Afghanistan in the 80s, but another civil war, in which case it's no longer with the Afghan government, but internally with the various so-called Mujahideen factions. And eventually, that's when the Taliban ended up getting the upper hand. And at that point, going back to Pakistan's role in this, Pakistan and the ISI in Pakistan, which is basically like the CIA of
Yeah.
Pakistan, they were they heavily favored the Taliban, and they were giving a huge amount of support to the Taliban, and that was a big factor in the Taliban getting the upper hand and eventually coming to power. Um, and when the Taliban did come to power, there was still fighting, especially like in the north. There was something which later on was called by the U.S. The Northern Alliance, and there was different fighting between different factions. But eventually, the Taliban came to power, and they were in power. And interestingly, the Taliban started supporting, because at this point there was the collapse of the Soviet Union and various civil wars and fighting in the Soviet Union, and there was fighting in Tajikistan, like
basically across the border, former Soviet Tajikistan, and the Taliban and I believe Al Qaeda were active in spreading, destabilizing across the border in Tajikistan, and also in the wars in Chechnya. The
Yeah.
There were a lot of so-called Mujahideen involved in that, and in the war in Yugoslavia as well. And also, this is a very important. I think this is very significant in the Gulf War. And this is acknowledged by mainstream sources. If they actually go into enough depth to get into this, is acknowledged by mainstream sources that actually the Mujahideen, so-called Mujahideen, offered to send forces to fight against Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War, and I think did send some. I don't know if they fought against the Iraqi army, but they offered to send forces to help Saudi Arabia against the Iraqi army. And I think I sort of made the connection between Iraq and Afghanistan, the Soviet Union, and I've talked before about how Iraq was very pro-Soviet and Saddam was very pro-Soviet. I think that's very interesting how the Mujahideen, after they were basically done being good assets for the U.S. to destabilize Afghanistan and fight against the Soviets, they are sort of offering themselves to be repurposed to be used against socialist Iraq. And there's a set of playing cards, I think, put out by the U.S. military. I'm not sure who exactly put it out, but you could find it online. It was a big deal during the Gulf War in the 90s. There was like a set of playing cards put out that like listed like all the leaders and countries of the various countries involved in the Gulf War. And the card for Afghanistan actually mentions how the so-called Mujahideen were offered to send forces to fight against Iraq in the Gulf War. I think that's quite an admission right there. And of course, this is before 9/11, so it's not quite as embarrassing yet. But later, that was certainly an embarrassing thing for the U.S.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So, speaking of 9/11, we mentioned a little bit so far. Me and Nick, we're actually going to be doing a podcast going more into depth on 9/11, probably bringing some other people in on a panel. We'll drop it around 9/11, and so we're just gonna cover it really in a
20th anniversary.
Yeah, 20th anniversary
big
too.
one.
Big one, yeah. So it's gonna be a big podcast. Look out for that.